All right. Welcome back to Vijñapti. I think I'm just gonna call it Vijñapti. I don't, it's not like an actual podcast yet, and it feels weird calling it the Vijñapti show. So I think I'll just say Vijñapti. Uh, we are back here with Nick Haight for chapter 6 of Why I Am Not a Buddhist by Evan Thompson. Nick, it's good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So last chapter, to me, this was the most, I think this was like the biggest takeaway, chapter for me personally. Um, I love his main thesis, and I love that he's talking about, why Buddhist modernism is a problem. Um, but I really, really love this last chapter on cosmopolitanism. So, yeah, let's get right into it. What did you make of this chapter in terms of his primary argument against Buddhist modernism? And then what did you make of it just in general?
I think that it is a very good move to in your, lengthy takedown of Buddhist modernism and all the issues you have with it to end on something that's inclusive and is far reaching rather than ending on something that's narrow and something that's, you know, singular in a lot of ways. And
Hmm.
thematically, what I mean is like, okay, you've spent this whole time taking down, all these different misunderstandings of Buddhism, throughout this whole book. And your readers are probably expecting that at the end, you're going to end on something like, here's what authentic Buddhism is. But if you do that, then you're actually making a lot of the same mistakes that, the people you're taking down are doing. You're
Right.
misrepresenting and you're essentializing and you're prioritizing and you're not acknowledging that,
Hmm.
it's not Buddhism, it's Buddhisms. You're not acknowledging that there's 2,500 years of history. You're not acknowledging that there's 300 million living self-identifying Buddhists. You're not acknowledging all of the sort of diversity and variety that exists within the tradition. And so it's a really good move that he ends on cosmopolitanism and the idea of reaching from many different sources. And he ends understanding and acknowledging diversity and variety rather than, a polemic against one thing and for the same thing, but in a different packaging. It's overall a very smart and good way to end in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. And I'm glad that you brought in that unique perspective. I remember thinking something kind of similarly, and I read a footnote or annotation that I wrote the first time I read it, and I was like, "Is there no room for consilience?" Because it seems at times he seems very perhaps like appears to be overly critical to the point of kind of excluding um you know it kind of what you're saying of proposing this like okay we should go back to Buddhism itself, but no, I think that's a really good assessment, and I think it was a very skillful way to end as well. um what did you make of his he gives like a historical analysis of Buddhism, a little bit more historical context. And he uses that to actually illustrate his point of cosmopolitanism before invoking Apaya, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But what did you make of the historical context that he gave for cosmopolitanism in a Buddhist context?
I think that his historical account was definitely designed and definitely sort of curated according to what he was building up to and the point that he was trying to make. I would just simply say that there are so many different versions of the history that he gave, and he only gave the one version. And,
Mhm.
all of them are equally true and untrue, including his. And
Yeah.
so, like, from a point of view of constructing his point about cosmopolitanism, I'm like, yeah, this is great. This works. This is good. From a point of view of saying this is something that actually happened, you know, it's got every bit as much of a leg to stand on as anything else, as any other version that we have out there. And, for all of them, the amount of leg to stand on is very close to zero because, none of us were alive then. Nothing was
Are
written down during that time. It's
yeah.
hard.
Are you referencing the like he gives like a story about Upaka, and it's like
Mhm.
the guy that the Buddha met right after he became enlightened, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Okay.
he starts it from, I believe, the birth of the Buddha. Or no, he starts
Yeah.
it from the renunciation. He starts it from whenever 35-year-old Siddhartha leaves and sits down to meditate to reach enlightenment. And then he goes through, like you say, through Upaka. And
Yeah.
so you know, whether that actually happened, mm, can't be sure.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
have a
what did
verse.
you what did you make about that? Let's talk about I was talking a little bit more about like the Sanskrit cosmopolis and like his
Oh, I
historical
see what you mean.
perspective of that. Yeah. But no, I actually am glad that you brought Upaka up. I like that story. But what did you think of it? I want to hear your thoughts.
I think it's a good distillation of a version that we've had before, but like I was saying, it's just you have to be sort of aware and careful about the fact that everything is hagiography and also nothing is hagiography when you're
What's
doing
hagiography?
hagiography is whenever literature is written about a figure after their lives or after an event in their lives, and it's embellished and dressed up in order to prop them up further as, you know, an important historical or religious figure.
Okay.
So there's like a bunch of hagiography, for example, nowadays about like the founding fathers, right? In America, these were guys who, left England and came to what is now the United States. And we have this whole idea that, for example, about George Washington, he couldn't tell a lie. And he chopped
Hmm.
down the cherry tree and he had to tell his dad because he couldn't tell a lie. That story
Yeah.
didn't actually happen, right? That's made up. That's hagiography right there.
I didn't know that, but I'm not too surprised. Sounds like a
Yeah.
very uh like the embodiment of like the Protestant ethic, like a
Right,
very
exactly.
yeah. But go ahead, you were saying.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hagiography about the Buddha too. There's a lot of
Mhm.
episodes we have that are ahistorical or quasi-historical or, you know, just uncertain about their historicity at all.
Yeah.
There's in the vein of Siddhartha Gautama hagiography, there's this idea that he met Jesus during Jesus's lost years. And in my mind, that's hagiography both about Jesus and about the Buddha himself. you know,
Yeah.
um, that's completely ahistorical and it doesn't exist in any records anywhere. And it's just a story to sort of bring Jesus into this age that we have in history of people like the Buddha and Confucius and others kind of coming up around the world. And
Right. I
and
believe it's called the Axial Age
that's right, the
in
axial age. We
yeah.
have the Buddha, we have Jesus, we have Confucius, we have Greek philosophers. I mean, we have, all of this stuff, all of this sort of navel gazing going on around the world. And there's this attempt to sort of, I don't know, I guess, make Jesus an authoritative figure in that as if he wasn't already.
Yeah. Like if he could have met the Buddha, then like he's got that spiritual clout or whatever.
Yeah, well, and it also is one of these things where it's like, does that make Jesus a bodhisattva or does that make the Buddha one of the disciples of Jesus? Or
Yeah.
are they just sort of, two colleagues? Are they fellow industry professionals? What is their
Yeah.
relationship? It depends on who you ask because the whole thing didn't actually happen.
Hmm. Gotcha. So are you saying this is kind of like I guess are you like in favor or not in favor? Because I could see it going like kind of both ways. Like I don't know if your takeaway is like be kind and compassionate, and then if you want to put a political angle in there, like be I don't know, have social programs that like help and enable people, then like I would say like that's ostensibly good.
Mhm.
But um if it's like you're looking for historical accuracy, probably not.
Yeah,
But I
well,
don't know.
certainly
What
the stories themselves have value in that regard, and it's not on any of us to take that value away. And
Mhm.
connecting it back to Evan Thompson, his story, that is a version of a story that exists out there, and it's a good teaching tool for the point that he's building up to, which
Hmm.
is, as you say, the Sanskrit cosmopolis or cosmopolis.
Hmm.
And I think that his point in discussing it is very strong, and I think that the story of Upaka sort of ties in very well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I think it also kind of is like a reflection of Thompson's personal stance. I sense a bit of feistiness and kind of like rebelliousness from Thompson. I feel like that's kind of why he wanted to put it in there too.
Yeah.
And I like that honestly. I'm kind of the same way. In myself a little bit. Um, and then I completely agree with you. So I'd love to hear like, yeah, how does he get it right with respect to like how Buddhism develops historically, how cosmopolitanism is kind of how that appears in the development of Buddhism. Yeah, what did you think?
Yeah, so there's a lot about the Sanskrit cosmopolis that I can't really speak to because it's outside of Buddhism and around Buddhism. And
Mm,
so there's so much text and so much history and um, so much, philosophical tradition, or so much, I guess you could say, like sacred writing tradition and sacred debate tradition that I'm not read up on, I'm not caught up on. But I think that one of the biggest and most important takeaways of all of that in Evan Thompson is that Buddhism came up in a very specific ecosystem, and it's influenced and affected by that ecosystem, and it has influence and effects on that ecosystem. And it's an
mhm,
ecosystem of course, schools of thought, of what we might now call philosophy or religion, or what we even might now call science. It's
mhm,
it's a textual thing. It's a textual environment. And so there's a lot of stuff in Buddhism especially in the sutras, that is responding directly to or speaking directly to that, ecosystem in that context. And so much of that gets lost to us nowadays. On Bright on Buddhism, I have to very often say, I know nobody thinks this way now, but
mhm.
someone did back when the Buddha was alive, and he had
Sure.
to sort of put that down. You know what I mean? Or he had
Mhm,
to say, well, it's right in this way, but it's wrong in that way.
mhm,
And so it's like, yeah, I know nobody thinks that, like, you know, the world was created by like a special material that is sentient but isn't a person or a god. It was just a material. No one actually believes that now, but I think that it's important that he speaks to that issue because people around him think that way. And in that there comes to be that kind of same environment, that sort of same ecosystem that we're talking about here, as he points out, as he rightly points out, leads into so much of the stuff that contributes to Buddhist exceptionalism and, the rhetoric, so to speak, of enlightenment and all of this stuff that he's talked about before. This is sort of like this ending chapter, and that part in particular is sort of like he's broken down all of the individual bits and described them in great detail, and now we get to see them all put together and see the big picture in a very, very productive way.
mhm. Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah, I think it's very like just as a piece of literature, I think he does a very good job at crafting his argument and then
Mhm.
um outlining it. And it's cool because it's like this is like stuff that actually happened like historically. Maybe not the Upaka um story or whatever, but the history, you know, of it happened. Um I'm curious to know, so we talked about this a little bit last time when we talked about kind of how Buddhism evolves along trade routes of the Silk Silk Road,
Mhm.
um, not Silk Route. And so he invokes that a little bit in this last chapter where he really distinguishes between uh I think the Sanskrit cosmopolis and then the the Latin cosmopolis, and he essentially
Mhm.
says like, look, in this idea of cosmopolitanism, when we think about it, oftentimes we think about it from the the standpoint of imperial Rome and the Roman Empire. And, they were very cosmopolitan in the sense that, like, they very much reached a broad swath of cultures in their outreach. And, but their outreach was like, hey, you speak this language? Well, not anymore. We're just going to kill you. And if you do, then, that's cool. You're a citizen of us, and now you pay taxes to us. And it's imperialist.
Yeah.
It's violent. It's colonialist. It's it's cosmopolitanism with a gun to your head, essentially.
Yeah.
But that's not what happened in the Sanskrit cosmopolis in Asia. Maybe a little bit, I'm not saying it was completely non-violent or whatever, but the way that he is talking about is he's saying that more or less people had the opportunity to opt into Sanskrit as the language that they spoke, to be a part of this broader um, regional continental community. And that's not how it was really in Rome. It was like, well, you're going to speak Latin because you have to, and we're going to force you to. Um, so could you talk a little bit and like give your way in there? I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but I just thought that was a very um, important realization for me the second time that I read it around.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it is it's good that he brings up that, cosmopolitanism is, even the word itself is inherently biased towards a Latin world, a Latin point of view,
Mhm.
and a Latin historical situation. And he's 100% correct to point out that there are varieties of cosmopolitanism all across history and culture. And, we could even say there's Roman cosmopolitanism, which is basically like economic and militaristic and settler colonialism, right? I'm going to go to you and I'm going to, at the sword point, create a trade route and also install my own governor. And then there's, this sort of Sanskrit cosmopolitanism, which is much more trade based. And there is still sort of, sword point diplomacy going on in a lot of cases, but it's very much more, relying on this Silk Route and on um, making use of natural resources like the Ganges River to transport goods and people and ideas. And now, what about American cosmopolitanism? What do we have going on here? We have people who come here and they're seeking a particular kind of life. We have people who are American born who leave here to seek a certain kind of life. We have sword point diplomacy or gunpoint diplomacy with a lot of places, but we also have sort of economic and trade diplomacy with a lot of other places. And we have, our own history of colonialism and imperialism that we need to sort of grapple with and understand. And the reality of our current cosmopolitanism is almost like, take all of the grand, larger themes of Roman and Sanskrit and Chinese and all of these other and Mongol cosmopolitanism and modernize them and complicate them and add another, several layers of history and complexity. And that's sort of what we have now, right?
Yeah.
It's like we have large land empire cosmopolitanism, we have large economic empire cosmopolitanism, and so on and so forth. And all of that leads to sort of the diversity of ideas and culture and people that we have now. And it's important to not just think of cosmopolitanism as one thing and as the result of one thing. And it's important to remember, too, connecting it back to Buddhism, that even then, you can't say Buddhism came out of this one thing. And you can't say that it was this one thing, right? We'll talk about it later when we get to it, about this idea of lineages, which I thought that he was very smart to bring up and very, very skillful and informative in
Sure.
describing. Um, but yeah, that's sort of it's a big giant web or network, you know, and from empires and cultures and history all the way to food. We've stopped thinking about it in sort of in terms of a chain or a pyramid and more like a web and a network. And it's the appropriate way to think about it.
Yeah. Um, Completely agree. I think that an ecological view of systems in general is, I think that we're, at least from my perception in academia, kind of starting to move more towards systems models of
Mhm.
organization in terms of how we think about the world. And I feel like that's the way to go as well. Um, let's work backwards a little bit for the viewers. So I've written an essay on on cosmopolitanism. Um, could you, in your own words, define what cosmopolitanism is kind of about, um, what you think, what your perception of Thompson thinks about it, because it is such an important um, idea for Vijñapti. And yeah, and then kind of towards the end, we'll come back and see, um, how does Thompson do? Is this idea like worth thinking about? Is this idea useful in the modern day? Um, because you're right, we are kind of the new Rome in a sense as Americans. I would argue English is the cosmopolitan language of the modern age. Um, and although my goals are oriented towards consciousness and the nature of the mind and all that, I also can't separate myself from my own upbringing as an American citizen. Um, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, that's just literally what it is. And
Mhm.
so could you talk a little bit about, yeah, what is cosmopolitanism? What's this idea? And then we can get into more of the more nitty gritty stuff with Buddhism. But yeah, what's your take?
Yeah, so I will give sort of a complicated way up to it, and then I'll give the one sentence answer after I've given the complicated way up to it,
Okay,
because I'm a professional academic. So
awesome.
we all have identities of different scale. You know, one identity that I have is um, Macon County, North Carolina native. Macon County is, you know, you could drive across it in any direction in 30 minutes. So that's a very small area. I could even say smaller than that and say like a specific valley in that county. And that's like one of my local identities. And then Macon County is another local identity. And then North Carolina native is another local identity. And then Southeast is another one. Or even before Southeast, you could say North Carolina and then the Carolinas and then Southeast and then American and then North American and then Westerner. And then finally, at the very end, is the most cosmopolitan identity that we all have, all 8 billion of us, is Earthling person, you know? And so cosmopolitanism is just speaking to that topmost layer of identity on top of all of your local identities. It's not sort of replacing your local identities or any other personal identities that you have, like sexual orientation, gender, or, you know, ethnicity, race, religion, political affiliation. It doesn't replace any of those things. It just sits kind of as an umbrella over the top of all of them. And so it's that layer of identity, and it is also a a state of being where you sort of are conscientious as an individual of that identity, that topmost layer of citizenry of the world, right?
Hmm.
You're part of the citizenry of Earth. You're part of the whole, you are one part of the entire whole human experience, past, present, and future. And my actions, my behaviors, my affiliations, my likes and dislikes, my thoughts, they have ramifications for all of my identities, right? I identify as a native of this one valley in Macon County, North Carolina, but I live on the West Coast in Seattle, right? and I have lived in the Midwest in Illinois. So it's a situation where, okay, my behavior to choose to move to those places for the reasons I did, they have an effect. They have a ramification on that small local identity. And then, of course, political affiliation. You know, I'll give you three guesses as to, the majority political affiliation of the people in that valley, right? And
Yeah.
let me just say that I am not that one. And so like that's part of it as well. So
Yeah.
then it comes to thinking about the whole entire world and being a citizen of that world. My choice to drive a car versus take the train, that sort of has an effect because of greenhouse gases and climate change. My choice is to buy this and not buy that. That has an effect on markets and capitalism and the economy that we live in. And so that is cosmopolitanism, is seeing your own life on the grandest, most zoomed out scale that you possibly can, and
Mhm.
being conscientious of that. In that way, it's a political, a moral, a metaphysical, a an economic, all of these things combined type of philosophy. And so there's a lot of overlap and a lot of alignment between that and Buddhism, right? Because so much about Buddhism is seeing is through meditation and practice, seeing your orientation, your position in relation to all other sentient beings, in relation to the
Mhm.
whole universe. What is your relationship to it? Are you coextensive with it? What does your awareness of it and of yourself mean? And what ought you do with that information? And how ought you act, knowing what you do about yourself and your orientation to the entire universe? And it
Yeah.
has religious answers to those
Mhm.
questions, right? When I say religious, I mean answers that you need faith in order to accept in a lot of cases.
Mhm. Or at least to contend with the
Right.
faith and engage with the notion of Buddhist faith.
Right. Like if you are a strict materialist in all senses of the word, in the sense like that you don't think that there exists anything beyond what can be sensed by the five senses, then there's answers to these questions in Buddhism that you simply will not accept, right?
Mhm.
Because Buddhism rejects materialism like
Mhm.
over and over again. If you're a nihilist and you think that, this is the only life we have, and because of that, morality is not important, it doesn't sort of stain your soul or uplift your soul in any way or something like that. If you think that morality is not a relevant discussion as a nihilist, Buddhism patently rejects that. There's a huge moral and ethical system that extends out of this religiosity, right? That you need faith to accept, and then that you need sort of faith to pursue in a behavioral and moral sense, right? So
Mhm.
Buddhism has a lot of overlap in sort of realizing your own position in the world of what can be sensed, but then even more importantly, in the world of what cannot be sensed, what is not experientially or experimentally verifiable in this life here, right? At least
Mhm.
not on a grand scale that can reach everyone, right? Some people have enlightenment experiences where they do see the zoomed out, you know, religious answer with their own eyes, right? And those mystical experiences are important. They are very important and valuable. And it's not on us to say they did or did not happen, or that they were the result or not the result of something real or not, right? That's not relevant. What's relevant is that, you know, they are sort of resting on their existence, their religion, their practice, their morality, their cosmopolitanism is resting on that zoomed out experience in a lot of ways. And um, so yeah, Buddhism, I don't want to say Buddhism is cosmopolitan from like from a prescriptive point of view, but there are a
Mhm.
lot of ways where you could say that descriptively that it is cosmopolitan.
Okay. That's awesome, and that's really cool. And that leads very well into the next part of this chapter, is that you bring up this discussion of ethics and how taking a cosmopolitan view of the world necessarily implies ethics. How do we live good lives? How do we live good lives in community with one another? How do we live good lives in community with one another on a massive global scale that we have now? Um, and I actually missed that in the first draft of my essay, and so I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to do this because I saw the second time I read it around I didn't talk about ethics as much as I would have liked. I feel like I was almost, in a sense, conflating cosmopolitanism with consilience, and I don't think that's bad. And we'll come back to that with the lineages thing because that was really important for me as well. But this discussion of ethics and its relevance for cosmopolitanism, I see it as, at least in my interpretation, kind of the heart of cosmopolitanism and what it means to have a cosmopolitan orientation of the world. And I like that I loved your analysis of Buddhism because um this whole time Thompson's arguing against this, like, seeing meditation as like brain science and like doing experiments with your own mind on your own inner consciousness or whatever. um, well, maybe that's kind of the Buddhist modernist view of it. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with doing that individually if you don't call it something that it's not. But um, what you're saying is that you can actually derive this ethical perspective and this ethical imperative of how to live your life through these mystical experiences, and that is the heart of meditation. That is the heart of these Buddhist practices, is to actually figure out a way to live harmoniously and understand your own place in the cosmos, in this world, with other sentient and human beings.
And what's
Um,
important about the way you've just described that is that that is the textually accurate way. That is the way that Buddhists themselves believe and have believed in history, right? So one of the
yeah.
issues that he takes with Buddhist modernism that I also take in a huge, huge way is the erasure that goes on whenever people who are mainly Westerners will go back and say the Buddhists were really doing experiments on their own mind. They were really doing cognitive reframing. They were really doing this. And it's like, no, I mean, you might be able to say, like, yes, the apple and the orange are both fruits, but you can't say that the orange tree was trying to grow apples. It was trying to grow oranges, right? And so
Yeah.
it's like, it's a situation where you don't get to say as a Westerner, especially one in 2024, these guys in India 2,500 years ago, they were really doing this. They said
I
they
know what
were
they
doing
were
this.
doing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't know what they were doing, especially, I mean, the biggest mistake that a lot of Buddhist modernists make is that they haven't read anything. You know, they haven't read anything where these people are saying what they did. And so it's not on me or you or anybody else to
Mhm,
evaluate the claims that people who wrote down the sutras are making. I think
mhm,
that it's on us instead to believe that the people who made these claims believe what they're saying and that what they are saying has a huge effect on what people do, right?
mhm,
I think that it's important to, and this is something that I've actually encouraged students to do when I've been a TA in the past, is move away from a conception of what insert religion here is, and instead move to a perspective of what people who affiliate themselves with insert religion here do, because
mhm,
religion isn't anything. It's sort of it's a concept. It's I don't want to say it's like made up in the sense of me saying it's all fake and materialism and atheism are the only true way. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's all sort of conceptual. It's all sort of
mhm,
this, it's a label that we've put onto a huge history of actions that people have done. And that action may have been writing something down. That action may have been gathering in a certain way to worship something in a certain way, right? But when you boil religion down to its most essential part, it's not just, it isn't just being something, it is doing something or it is causing somebody to do something. or it is somebody themselves doing something. So in that sense, we should think of it in a sort of operational way um, rather than in a ontological fashion.
Hmm.
And I just wanted to pop in and say that about what you're saying about meditation, because it's like, why do Buddhists meditate? Well, whenever you read the texts, or otherwise when you ask monastic people in real life, that's sort of the answer they give, and that's the right answer because they're the Buddhists and I'm not.
Yeah. And yeah, that's just because it's not even necessarily, and I think this is why I love Buddhism so much. And I'll say this now. I truly do believe, in my own opinion, I'm not saying that I'm right, that well, no, I won't say that. I love Buddhism the most, but I love Buddhism the most not because it's the most aligned with science and not because it's the most experimentally verifiable or whatever, but I truly believe that Buddhism has something very unique to offer to religious discussions, to ethical discussions, to discussions about the nature of the mind that other religions simply don't. I'm not saying that they don't in their own ways. I'm just and or that they're not concerned with many of the same questions of how to live a good life, what happens to you after you die, how do you live your life in light of that, whatever we believe about it. Um, but I do so because in the same way that a Christian thinks Christianity is the best religion because of dot 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 that you find in the Bible, or in the same way that a Muslim thinks Islam is the best religion because dot 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 that you read in the Quran. Um, that's just my own opinion. It doesn't mean Buddhism is the best religion, but it's why I love it the most. And we're reading a book called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, so I guess I just felt compelled to say that. But yeah, any thoughts on that before we move on or continue this discussion on ethics?
No, let's get further into the ethics. This is the stuff I like.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Cool. So yeah, from there we can transition into Apaya. Now, I actually read Apaya's book very shortly after I read Thompson's book. I think his full name is Kwame Anthony Apaya, and he's I think a moral philosopher. It's kind of how he defines himself, but he studies culture, identity, ethics, all this stuff. And he wrote a book called Cosmopolitanism. I think it's the ethics of being a stranger in a cosmopolitan world or something like that.
I
But
think I have the title here. It's Cosmopolitanism, Ethics in a World of Strangers.
yes, that's it. That's it. Um, yeah, and so as the title implies, he's very much focused on the ethical dimension of cosmopolitanism. And he gives a bunch of different a bit of a historical overview of like, yes, there's this economic dimension, which is largely free market based and plays very well into this neoliberal paradigm of, consumer capitalism. But that's fine. We don't have to get into that right now. Um, but yeah, so his idea, from what I've gathered, is that we need cosmopolitanism because we literally live in a world filled with different ethical values, with different religious ideas, with different ways of seeing the world. And in Apaya's view, um, to sum up his thesis, I guess, is that we shouldn't try to build consensus. In other words, we shouldn't try to say like, let's all gather together and figure out like what the answer is, because we literally can't do that. We're not going to do that. And also, we shouldn't want to do that. In his view, and I mean, and in my view, the world is a beautiful place because we have so many different traditions and interchange and exchange and flow between various historical cultural traditions. We shouldn't want to eliminate that, or by establishing some sort of hegemony of values. But what he says that we should do is we should try to get along with each other as best as we can and try to find a way to live a good life and create a good society in light of that goal of getting along despite our intractable differences much of the time. And he says the way to do that is conversation. He says that we should talk to each other, not because we're going to change each other's minds, because we're probably not, although we might, and that would be great. But that's not his main goal of conversation. His main goal of conversation is to get us used to existing with people who we don't agree with, who we might not like, but to exist in that same place and be human together. Now that's my synopsis. That's what I took from his ethical by invoking Apaya here. Did I miss anything, or do you? What's your take here? What's your analysis?
Yeah, that's a very good sum up of his argument and sort of his point of view of how ethics factors into cosmopolitanism. What I really like about this argument is primarily two things. One thing is that it is absolutely true. And the part where he says, you know, we live in a world of a diversity of ideas, a diversity of people, a diversity of cultures, a diversity of ways that people think the world should be. And that creates an imperative, right? That part is absolutely true. There's no avoiding it. The internet exists. People go on the internet and see stuff all the time. Hopefully they see us, right? But they go on the internet and see stuff all the time created by, you know, and posted by and shared by people who have different ideas than they do. And there's so many people out there who are afraid of that and who actually are against that being possible, right? And even though I don't agree with that perspective, I can understand that it is scary. It's scary to sort of be so close to so much unfamiliarity, right? But then we get to the second part of why I like it, why I like Apaya's system here is that, you know, one reason that people are scared, whether this is legitimate or not, of being up close and personal with a diversity of people and ideas is because they think that their own ideas are going to get sort of invalidated or mowed over or, you know, just completely railroaded, and that in some way they themselves are going to be invalidated, right? And, you know, that's the important part of the second portion here, which is that he doesn't say, okay, and now in this, you know, world, we should come to consensus by majority or by a specific philosophical system or by a specific discourse or pattern of discourse. He says we should just become familiar and just appreciate each other. You know,
Yeah,
we should just know who and what is out there. And
yeah,
that alone is good, right? He's arguing that that alone is morally and ethically a good thing. And
hmm
it's actually pretty ingenious because like I've met dozens of people who identify as ultra far right conservative, right? I mean, where did I say I was from earlier, right? I mean, I have no way to avoid it. And at the same time as they are constantly afraid of what they call, you know, globalism, the, you know, other countries interfering in their lives, other people from far away interfering with their world. At the same time as there is that, I know every single one of them also has a really close, dear friend who they're nice to, who they are good to, who is not American, who is not white, who is not Christian, who is not whatever identity they've decided they're afraid is going to be sort of invalidated, mowed over, blacked out, whatever. Right.
right.
And, you know, a lot of discourse in American culture right now has to do with one side asking, you know, how could there be such a hypocrisy? How could there be such a disconnect? How are these people just must be stupid, right? And a little bit of that is true. But on the other hand, what Apaya is speaking to is like, you know, instead of speaking to the stupidity of it and the hypocrisy of it, we should be able to see what's going on here. Familiarity is being prioritized over this fear. They are familiar with their friends who are black, who are Mexican, who are whatever, whoever, and they are like saying, they're being racist when they say, or sexist or transphobic or homophobic, whatever you like, whenever they say, but my friend Johnny, he's one of the good ones, right? It's a very racist thing to say, but it's speaking to something that's real and is actually a productive idea, which is that familiarity matters to those people just as much as it matters to us. And
Hmm.
by building familiarity, by building a larger community, a larger sort of world, this is Luna. By building a larger
Luna's
world,
also part of our cosmopolitan world here.
yeah, she's attacking the computer, so I might shake a little bit in the camera.
Yeah, no
Um,
worries.
by creating a larger community, a larger network, a larger world for these individual people where they feel just as valuable as anybody else, and when they don't feel threatened by, being replaced or invalidated or blacked out, and when they are not sort of being preyed upon with misinformation, then familiarity necessarily leads to living a more ethical and moral life. And this is totally verifiable, totally real, totally, you know, totally the way to go, totally productive, I think.
Yeah. Um, to take a Taoist concept, it reminds me of Wu Wei in the
Hmm.
sense of the goal is to get people to get along with each other, to not kill each other, to not fight each other. And, you know, if you force people to do that, which I think, is kind of the downfall of a lot of what I see in progressivism, is it's like you have to get along with each other. You have to, and while I don't necessarily knock the intention, it's like you literally cannot force people to be nice, because even if you did, it's coerced, and
Right.
therefore not real, and therefore not sustainable. But what a pie is doing is just letting it happen, not trying to force people to get along and force people, but just allowing the natural getting alongness of being human to emerge from, as you're saying, just becoming familiar with each other and just living together and saying, you know, yeah, like, the Bible says that this guy's going to hell when he dies because he has a boyfriend, but also, he can be my neighbor and I can kind of just talk to him when I see him at the mailbox, and, it doesn't have to be a big thing. That's what he's going for. And yeah, I didn't actually think about that until I said that right now, but that just seems so powerful to me. I really like Taoism. I don't know if I've mentioned that, but Taoism's my probably that one, Taoism is actually my favorite religion. So I just think the Wu Wei let nature take its course thing is I don't know. I kind of see that in his interpretation, although I'm sure that's not how he intended it. Um yeah. Any any thoughts on conversation? Um because I actually now want to turn a little bit to the opposite of that, which is what I would regard as the danger of relativism. But would you like to add anything before we go into that?
Yeah, before we get into that, I have a seriously good Netflix recommendation for more on basically watching Apaya and his argument be applied and lived and performed and done on camera in real time. And there's a famous rapper out there from Atlanta, Georgia, where I've lived and where I share some amount of local identity. And his name is Killer Mike. And he created this short 5 episode documentary series. And I'm just looking up the title of it right now
Mhm.
on Netflix. And I think it's the very first episode um, of this series, which is called Trigger Warning with Killer Mike. He goes into a very rural, very white retirement home full of like 75, 85-year-old people. who are all mostly white, all mostly Christian, all mostly Republican, etc.
Old
And
white people.
yeah, and he gives a performance of one of his songs a cappella, and it's a rap song, right? So it's something that's completely foreign to their own experience, but it's genuine to his, right? I mean,
Hmm.
he's rapping about real issues that have affected his life, and you know, it's a little bit comical because the camera pans and you see their faces just completely incredulous, and then every once in a while you see a guy kind of like bopping along and enjoying himself. Like it's funny. But
Okay.
then after that performance, he sits down with some of these people and they try to find some common ground through conversation about stuff and things. And there's funny moments where it's like, okay, this was put into this series because it's hilarious and because it's like, you're supposed to, as the viewer, being on Killer Mike's side, you're supposed to be gobsmacked that somebody said that to his face, right? But at the same time, what I can appreciate about what he's up to is that he is going out of his way to sit down with people who don't agree with him and sit down with people whose experiences and whose view of the world is so distant from his own. And they're sitting down to try to find some common ground, try to find some familiarity, try to find some space for each other in their individual lives. And did he change minds? Did he change the world by doing this? I don't really think so. But he still did something really good by doing this. And he did something that is productive and is a step in the right direction nonetheless, right? Do I think that now some of those people in that retirement home voted for Kamala this last election? I know they didn't, right? If they were still alive, they absolutely did not. But he had space in his life for them, and they had space in their lives for him. And that's better than this, total sequestering that identity politics leads to.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so let's get right into the next thing. Thank you for that recommendation. I'll link it in the description. Um, so there's familiarity, which is a good thing because that can and has the potential to breed, I would say, peace, or at the very least tolerance. And that's the bare minimum is nonviolence towards other people, ostensibly to have respect. But I would say even having respect for people isn't really, necessary. It's not like we can compel people to feel certain things toward each other. Um, the counter to that, I would say, is the danger of relativism. And I'm gonna invoke, not invoke, I'm gonna talk about Joe Rogan here because I actually think he's a really perfect example of that. So Joe, if you haven't seen his podcast, he'll literally talk to anyone. He'll have anyone on his show. And on the one hand, I appreciate that. I like that he's willing to hear different sides, hear every different voice, even if like 90% of it's like jujitsu or MMA guys that are coming on, and I really couldn't care less about that. But he is willing to hear all of those different discussions. He also just endorsed Donald Trump for president, which I think is bullshit. Um, so so this is where the danger comes in here, I think, is the danger in saying that because everyone has a perspective and because everyone has a voice, um, that that necessarily implies that those voices are all equally legitimate, or that those ideas are all equally legitimate. And that's just not the case. The idea that women should be subservient to men is not like an equal perspective to the position that women don't fucking owe men anything. The idea that, I mean, you can see where I'm going with this. So I guess my question to you, and I'd love an answer because I struggle with this all the time, is like, yeah, how do well, I'll answer a little bit and then I want to hear what you think about it. I think that we need to demand accountability where we also like are seeking familiarity. In other words,
Mm.
sure, have Donald Trump on your show, but don't just play patty cake with him for 3 hours and then say like, oh yeah, dude, you're the guy, immigration and all that. Say, hey, Donald Trump, nice to meet you. Thanks for coming on my show. Can you explain your relationship with Jeffrey Epstein to me? Can you explain why you said that Jeffrey Epstein likes him young, and why we now have a voice recording that of Jeffrey saying that you're his best friend? Can talk about that? I want to hear that. Um, because Donald Trump isn't just another like perspective, and it's not just Trump either. It's I would say people in power. Um, well, I'll hear from you now. I could go on, but um, I feel like accountability, seeking justice, and at the bare minimum, non-abuse, and what would be the other thing? Yeah, I think that people with immense power, like billionaires, like politicians, should have a little bit more fire under their chair when they're, given these opportunities to speak in public. Um, but what do you think? Whatever comes to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up Joe Rogan in this conversation because, you know, I agree that like his perspective of I'll talk to anybody is by itself removed from the history and the present of Joe Rogan himself and his show. That's a good perspective to have. But then, like you say, he ends up
It's
elevating,
Socratic.
do what? It's Socratic, yeah.
Hmm.
But the end result has been and is that he elevates radical minority voices. And not when I say minority, I don't mean, people who are of an ethnicity or an identity racially or, religiously that is not the majority. I mean, like a minority voice in the sense of like a small radical political or ethical point of view. He
Like
elevates,
billionaires.
exactly right. He elevates and amplifies those voices in order specifically to build his, media empire, make himself money, make his guests money, but also to to sort of like you say, position those opinions and those ideas as equally legitimate next to very popular majority ideas, right? So if you do a poll, you find 2/3 of Americans think that universal health care is a good idea and that America should do it. But then you don't hear anybody say that on his show. You hear people say the opposite, the 1/3 opinion, and it gets millions and millions and millions of listens, right? So he's amplifying these radical points of view. He's amplifying these minority points of view. And it's, the perspective might be fair, but the practice is not fair, right? He's not being fair and also having on just as many people who are having this majority view. So I do think that like for one thing, I do think that if you're going to have a perspective like that, you have to be way more careful in who you choose. But then in doing so, he doesn't make as much money, right? So his decisions with who he has as a guest, they're completely financial. It's not from that perspective of I'll have anyone on. It's like who can make me the most money right now. And so he's guilty, so to speak, of the same sort of behaviors and ideas that media magnates the world over are guilty of, right? It's not what's true. It's not what's real. It's not what's an accurate sampling of the world. It's what's going to get clicks. It's what's going to get views. And in that regard, it's very disingenuous.
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually want to push back on the kind of like the majority versus the minority view, and I'm so now I'll talk about Israel a little bit. So this is a statistical fact that comes from Israeli sources, and that is that I think it's something like 2/3. I think it's actually slightly more than 2/3 of Israeli citizens, not of IDF soldiers, of Israeli citizens themselves, believe that it is acceptable for IDF soldiers to rape Palestinian women who are believed to be Hamas terrorists. Well, that's, I mean, I think we're kind of losing the words a little bit to describe how atrocious and horrific that is. But that's a case where the majority believes this one thing. And again, I'm not asking it to be like just contrarian or whatever, but it's like how how do you be one, since we're talking about cosmopolitanism, cosmopolitan, but two, like, yeah, what does that say about like democracy and ethics in general when it's like majority of people believe the wrong shit? I mean, we think that this country's backwards, but it's like that's insane. That's literally insanity. And to say nothing of Judaism, obviously, but it's crazy. Um, so yeah, I guess what are your thoughts there? Because I I've often found the majority case to be not compelling, but then a Apaya would say like, well, the I don't know. I don't know. I just felt like that was a salient example
Yeah, no, it's
to
good that you
give.
mentioned that because like yes, the majority can be wrong, right? And so like I think that majority minority opinions, majority minority discourses, they should factor in when you're thinking about sampling if you want to talk to everybody and anybody. And my point about Joe Rogan was that it doesn't, right? It just simply doesn't. And so it wasn't necessarily me sort of prioritizing or emphasizing majority thought
Mhm.
processes over any others, over any other practice for conversation, for choosing opinions, for choosing who you have on your show, for choosing anything like that. It was more about like showing that if he was doing what he says he does accurately, then it would look like this, and it doesn't, meaning that he's disingenuous. Um, so that brings me to the second point. What do we do whenever the majority is wrong? You know, whenever, and it's true in Israel, like you say, but it's also true here in the sense that, like, you know, 50.5% of people who voted in the 2024 election think that Donald Trump should be president, right? They thought that he was better for candidate than Kamala Harris. And so, like, yeah, what do you do whenever the majority is doing something that's actively harmful, believing something that's actively harmful, perpetuating an idea that's actively harmful? And that comes around to, the second thing you said earlier, which is like, yes, accountability has to be a part of it. And there has to be, at the very minimum, a utilitarian point of view here, right? You have to do the best for the most, and you have to do bad for as few as possible, right? And I think that one of the beauties of Apaya's familiarity, his concept of familiarity, specifically as something that is built out of conversation, is built out of an expansion of community, it builds right into utilitarianism. Because
Mhm.
whenever people make decisions, it's a well-known fact that human beings, when they make decisions, they are making decisions basically for themselves and for the people that they have close blood ties to and close, loving, friendly relationships with, and nobody else, right? And so if you surround yourself only with people that would benefit from, you know, something like this, then you're falling further into sequestered identity politics and your community is shrinking, not growing. But if you build conversation, or I'm sorry, if you build familiarity through conversation, your community is growing and you're expanding your horizons when it comes to making decisions that regard ethics and morality and government and so on and so forth. And so that will absolutely change your vote, so to speak. When you ask yourself, if you're a billionaire who only hangs out with billionaires and someone asks you what's best for people, you're going to say what's best for billionaires. But if you're a billionaire who has homeless friends, has friends from other countries that are not wealthy, has friends from this country that are struggling to get by, right? First off, you should give them your money. But second off, like you're going to understand the world differently and you're going to understand, yes, I am well off. I am lucky. I have X, Y, and Z resources, but they don't. And so the world should take care of them just as much as it has taken care of me because they are just as human as me. They are just as person as me because I've built familiarity, right? So whenever the question of what's best for the most is posed to that person, then they're going to have a very different answer. And so it's sort of like if conversation is the seed and then familiarity is the plant and then utilitarianism is one of the kinds of flowers that you get or one of the kinds of fruits that you get. And there's many others, right? That's another beauty of it is that it doesn't necessarily sort of railroad you to specifically utilitarianism, but that's just an example, and it's a good example of, at minimum, what you need in order for accountability to be relevant and also in order for there to be, you know, a way to say, yeah, it's actually wrong and messed up that two-thirds of Israeli citizens think it's okay for Palestinian women to be raped by the IDF.
Yeah. Um, I forget what exactly you said, but I want to answer my own question a little bit here. And Apaya doesn't necessarily say this, but I want to say it because I mean, I'm politically awake enough now, and I see what's happening in the world. I think that actually accountability is not just like a part of conversation or that like it could be a result of converse. I think it actually has to be the bedrock of conversation. And I'll draw a little bit on my experience professionally here. So I worked in a domestic violence center for specifically for rehabilitating abusive men. And I was taking some courses at school that kind of aligned nicely with that. And one of the takeaways that I got, and the clinical director of the agency actually says this explicitly, and he says that couples counseling is actually very, very bad for abusive relationships because most therapists actually can't identify um, what is an abusive relationship and when abuse is actually occurring. Um, I'm not saying that they necessarily intentionally condone it, but just that it's actually kind of a niche subset of clinical work is working with abusive partners. And so he says that there has to be no abuse. That's the key I was getting to. There has to be no abuse in order for couples counseling to be a viable option for that relationship to continue. In other words, if the man is still in the mentality, assuming it's a heteronormative relationship, if the man is still in the mentality of it is for any reason acceptable for me to hit my wife, for me to beat my kids, for me to take a strap and beat the dog in front of my son because he's not acting right or whatever, that relationship cannot succeed within the paradigm of couples counseling because there is still ongoing violence. The violence has to end and it has to cease, not because the man is an inherently bad human being and because he's a failed person as a human, but because the relationship dynamic literally cannot work and cannot be healthy if violence is still present, if violence is still being perpetrated. Turning that to Israel and Palestine, I'm all for conversations between both sides. I'm all for conversations between opposing viewpoints, but you can't have healing from that, actual, genuine, productive, not even healing, but just, what we're talking about, a familiarity, while abuse and genocide and slaughter is actively being committed because that is not real. And it literally fundamentally cannot lead to peace if violence is taken to be or presupposed to be a part of that equation. It just literally cannot work. So that's what I would add to that. And then if I could talk a little bit about oppression, I would say it even works for things that aren't necessarily genocide or domestic violence or whatever. Um, you could say, I don't know, like we can have discussions between both sides. Yeah, sure. As long as it's guaranteed that gay people can still marry each other, as long as it's guaranteed that women have, full rights of their reproductive health, as long for all those things, then we can have conversations that can actually lead to peace. Um, and unfortunately, in the year 2024, we're just not there yet, and not in every place that we would like to be. Um, so that was kind of long-winded, but I felt the need to articulate that for myself at least.
No, that's very good.
Kind
I
of
appreciate that you brought that up, and I agree. I think that that's a fantastic point, and it's definitely relevant to the conversation. And, you know, viewers, listeners, they're going to think that this was impossible. There was no way that this could happen, but I'm about to do it. I'm about to say it. I'm about to make it real. This is a very Buddhist conversation. The biggest
okay.
twist of the whole episode, right, is that these two guys talking about Buddhism are going to connect what they've been talking about back to Buddhism. No one
Let's do
could
it.
no one could have ever expected this.
No way.
What is happening here? What we're talking about is in real time the parable of the poisoned arrow. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the parable of the poisoned arrow is this story where the Buddha was teaching what was teaching, and he says, and this is, I'm just reading this off the Wikipedia page. It's a translation. I just found it quickly because I was thinking about it while you were saying that.
Yep.
He says, it's just as if a man were wounded with an arrow smeared thickly with poison. His friends and companions, kinsmen and relatives would provide him with a surgeon, and the man would say, I won't have this arrow removed until I know whether the man who wounded me was a warrior, a priest, a merchant, or a worker, or whatever. He would say, I won't have this arrow removed until I know the given name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether he was tall, medium, or short, dark, ruddy brown, golden colored, his home village, his hometown, his home city, until I know whether the bow was a crossbow or a long bow, until I know whether the bowstring was fiber, bamboo threads. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The man says, I won't have this arrow removed until X, Y, Z, blah, 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 blah. And in its own way, this is sort of talking about what you're talking about. In its own way, it's like, it's speaking to this fact of like, um, there can be sort of, as long as there's sort of active violence going on, as long as there's sort of this, I don't know, this volley back and forth of I do something bad to somebody else and then they do something bad back to me, or they want to do something bad back to me, then there can be no growth, no movement forward, right?
Mhm.
We're listening to this parable, and this man's coming up with this list of things, this checkbox list of things that must be checked off before the arrow can be removed from him. And it's all sort of revengey. It's all sort of, like, I need to know all this stuff so I can find him later, or so that I can, do something to him later. Right. And um, all the while he's wounded by a poisoned arrow. Right. And, I didn't bring this up to say like, you know, who shot first. And I'm not bringing this up to say, you know, that we should not hold people accountable for violence. But I am bringing it up
Yeah.
to say that,
Like you're not saying it's like a both sides
right,
kind of thing. Yeah.
it's not a both sides kind of thing. What I am saying is that it's, I think that the point that we're led to sort of get out of this parable in text is different. But I think that one way to interpret it is that the man who's wounded by the poisoned arrow is stuck in the cycle of, vengeance and revenge, and of, basically a two-way fight, right? And as part of it, he's sort of being poisoned. He's wounded and he can't ever sort of come out of that state. It's always a sort of, you know, always return in kind sort of point of view,
Yeah,
right?
maybe it's kind of like he's like stuck in this mentality, and that mentality is not allowing him to heal because he's literally not doing healing because of like he's stuck in that mentality in the same way that, someone who's violent or abusive, well, they're not allowing healing to flourish because it's you literally can't heal when you're stuck in that mentality.
Yeah.
That's I don't know if that's probably not how it was intended, but that's kind of how I
Yeah. Well, like,
interpreted.
let's imagine, I mean, if I get punched, right, then no growth can happen as long as that person is punching people. And also, no growth can happen in the relationship, so to speak. Um, if I have this idea, well, I have to punch back. I have to punch back.
Mm,
Where are they?
yeah, yeah.
Let me punch
I
them back.
Yeah, no, that actually makes a lot of sense. To just go into like a little clinical stuff, and then um I'd like to move on in just a second.
Yes.
Could you give me 1 second to let's get back into it. Sorry for the delay there, everyone. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, the clinical thing. So a lot of times with abusive people, and it's not just abusive men, it's abusive partners in general. There is this like victimhood, this like victim mentality when actually you're doing the oppressor. So again, to use a heteronormative example, it's kind of like a man will get into this victim mentality of like, hey, she said this, and so therefore I have the right to hit her. And it's like, no, that's no, you're stuck in this mentality that you have to aggress back, that
Yeah.
you have to. I mean, maybe his wife did say something to get under his skin, or maybe she said something that was like intended to hurt him and was actually really mean. That doesn't mean that he has to aggress back,
Yeah.
and especially not physically violently. Um, that's kind of how I interpreted that parable is like you're saying, like stuck in this like revenge cycle mentality, um, so to speak.
Yeah. I think
Um,
that, like, in the original parable of the poisoned arrow, the man who's shot with the arrow is not an abuser. But I think I was speaking to the fact of, like, what you're saying. If you're just stuck in this, like, fight back, hit back, whatever, even if you were never hit in the first place, even if this victim mentality comes out of illegitimate places, which sometimes it can, then it just perpetuates the violence. And then at the end of the parable, the man dies because, like, all the while he didn't know any of these things. He was so stuck. And all the while he was being poisoned by anger, by revenge, by all this stuff that was not productive for him.
yeah, yeah. Um, I think so. Okay, so and I'm sure we'll come back to ethics. That's kind of, I feel like, the main theme of this chapter. But okay, so now we're getting into the intellectual lineages that Varela talks about, excuse me. So I'll read this quote, and then it sounds like you already had some stuff that you wanted to say, but he says that within science there are actually intellectual lineages in the way that we would say Buddhism has its own traditional lineages. You have Theravada Buddhism, you have Mahayana, you have Vajrayana, and then within that you have tons and tons of different schools. Well, he's saying that science is the same way. And in this sense, I don't know if he actually says it explicitly, but he almost describes this cultural uh, like dimension to science. And I would very much agree with that. I would say that if you want to understand science well, and I say this as a non-scientist and honestly someone who's not even very good at science, um, you have to understand that science invokes different philosophies and presupposes various philosophical viewpoints. What did you make of his idea of he says there's distinct lineages exist not within Buddhism but also within science. What do you think?
I think it's 100% true. I think that it is 100% true. And I think that it is critical no matter if you are a scientist, a scholar of religion, if you're a cashier at McDonald's, if you are a Christian, if you're a Jewish person, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Buddhist, if you are anything, I think it's so important to see the network that precedes you, not just the network you're in now, where, you know, I have friends that are and are not Buddhist. I have friends that are and are not American, whatever. I'm talking about like also how much of who I am and how I think is sort of determined by those who came before me, those who are around me, and how much of that can I see and have control over versus how much do I lies beneath the surface that I can't really control because I can't see it very well or something like that.
Hmm.
And it's critically important to be aware of that sort of water that you are swimming in, to be aware of that developmental timeline that you're a part of, right? This is what's so critical about Buddhism in particular when it comes to Buddhist modernism, is because, like, if I met somebody who identified as a secular Buddhist, I wouldn't start yelling at them that they were like colonial and that they were being like imperialistic assholes, right? I that's not productive, because I don't think that most of them see the colonial issues, the colonial tensions, the fraught nature of what they're doing and how they think and believe. I think that they are finding secular Buddhism or Buddhist modernism, either way, and they're finding it and being interested in it. And it's actually like very real and productive and genuine reasons why they want to be a part of it. But they don't realize that what they're doing is they're building on a tradition of mysticizing and mystifying Asia. They're building on a tradition of erasing ritual and prioritizing, you know, prioritizing basically recapitulated, repackaged Protestant ethic. And they're sort of watering down so much of the moral and ethical side and the reason behind the moral and ethical side. And they're conflating it with science in a way that like has colonial tensions and imperial tensions involved in it. And so it's like, okay, this is like you're not, if you knew, you wouldn't do this. If you knew, you wouldn't think this way. You know what I'm saying? If you knew that
Hmm.
that was what was going on here, then it wouldn't be nearly as attractive to you, right? And that's an example of intellectual lineage, right? If you're a part of this, then you're part of that lineage. You're inserting yourself into that lineage. And to do so unconscious of all this stuff that's going on behind the scenes, it's just that's not good. That is not
Hmm.
good. That is very, very dangerous, you know? And so I'm not saying like read everything that's ever been written about whatever you're doing in the moment before you ever do it, right? That's by definition analysis paralysis. I'm just saying, you know, just be a little bit aware of an outsider perspective.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah. Um, for sure. I think so too. And like you're saying, I think it's so important with science because people have this monolithic view of science. And I
Hmm.
draw on Neil deGrasse Tyson a lot because he's kind of just I think a very memey person when it comes to this point we're trying to articulate. But I think people do look at him and are kind of like, oh, what's he said something on a podcast like, why would you ever mess around with philosophy when you have every answer you could possibly need in life through science? And it's like, okay, no,
That's not how it
but
works.
but some people actually like see that and they're like, oh yeah, dude, that's a very that's a very good perspective. I don't, but some people do. And it's because I think of this like not knowing like what science is and that it does like invoke empiricism which is a philosophical viewpoint and has its own methodologies. But um, so with respect to the conversation between science and Buddhism and Buddhist modernism and I guess like how we can skillfully talk about the mind, you know, whether that's science and Buddhism or science and Christian mysticism or and whatever. Um, what are your thoughts for carrying out that endeavor skillfully? And I guess like what should we bear in mind?
We just have to bear in mind agendas on all sides. I think that thinking critically is, we toss it around all the time in the world today by saying these people or those people, they are so bad at thinking critically. Um, and when we do that, it's true in a lot of cases, but it's not true because that means these or those people are stupid and they're inferior. It's actually because critical thinking is actually kind of hard to do. I mean, we have to, let's be real, let's be honest with ourselves and each other and acknowledge that critical thinking is a skill and skills take practice. And to be really good at it takes a lot of practice, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you have to sort of go out of your way because the human brain is a machine that always goes for the easiest option, right? The least energy expenditure. And that's not wrong. That's not inherently a bad thing. It's just something that you have to choose against if you want what's best for yourself and for the most, right?
yeah.
And so in thinking critically, we take two things next to each other and we're looking for the overlap, the alignment, the relationship, and we have to ask ourselves who stands to benefit from A, who stands to benefit from B, who stands to benefit if A and B are like this, if they're so close together and so tightly related that they have this relationship sort of intellectually. And so what I'm speaking about here particularly is with science. We can't talk about science as a monolithic edifice like we've been saying. We have to think of sciences, right? The plural of science. And we have to say, okay, who stands to benefit from essentializing and reducing science to this edifice? And how do they reduce it to this edifice? What do they say it actually is when they say science? And why do they benefit from thinking of it that way? And so, of course, like you say, a lot of people boil it down to basically, materialism. And they boil it down to a way of looking at the world that's based on sensible, like five senses, sensible evidence and experiential evidence. And they boil it down to that which can be sort of demonstrated in a repeatable and a falsifiable fashion, right?
Mhm.
And they're not perfect about that. We know that for a fact. They're not perfect about that,
Yeah.
but they sort of proclaim to be doing this. Those people who listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson and
Mhm.
say, yeah, anything that needs to be known about the world can be figured out through experimentation. Okay, so someone stands to benefit there. They sort of get to have the means of knowledge production in their wheelhouse because science is a Western invention. And
Mhm.
it was sort of invented with colonial tensions in mind. It was invented with this idea that Europe and the imperial powers could, sort of have it and be the paragons of knowledge production. And, you know, it was for the people they colonized to consume that knowledge, right? And to be raised up into civilization by it. And
Yeah.
that's
And to
all of that.
control people. Oh, sorry.
Exactly. No, yeah,
Uh,
exactly. To control. And that is all of academia. That is all of
yeah.
it. It doesn't matter if you're an anthropologist, a religion studies scholar, a Buddhist studies scholar, a scientist, a linguist, an English literature person, a Japanese literature person. It doesn't matter what you study in academia, your field is inherently sort of influenced and affected by colonial history because academia as an edifice itself exists because of colonial reasons, right?
Hmm. And just historically, not even, I mean, the colonial dimension is not good. obviously, but it's like that's just
That's the real
kind of a
history.
historical, yeah, yeah. I really like that you're like, again, going back to this like ethical dimension, um, because it's absolutely the heart of Apaya's perspective on cosmopolitanism. And kind of as you were saying that, I'm reading this book now on psychiatry, and it's really astounding to look at the history of it and see just how much of psychiatry, and I personally, and this is my own bias, but I see psychiatry as the greatest example of how science is used as a tool of control, of how
Hmm.
science is used as a tool of control. Eugenics, forced medication, um, forced sterilization out of this idea of, the scientific notion that white people are somehow genetically inferior. And, you know, it's not as if these people didn't have models for it. They did have models for it because, Nick, as I'm sure you all know, Black people and insane people have more diseased levels of germplasm in their bloodstream. And so that's why, you know, we need to do all this horrible shit. And it's like, I think that sometimes people take a naive view and don't realize that even if they happen upon, you know, let's just say that there is a correct position, because sometimes there is. You should just get vaccinated most of the time, probably, right? You should just wash your hands before you eat and do surgery, probably. Um, but that's kind of just something that you arrive at because in your culture you were taught, rightfully, wash your hands before you eat. There's germs on your hands when you play and stuff like that. Um, but you didn't arrive at that conclusion because you did an experiment and you took, a decent sample size and you ran them and you measured how much bacteria was on their hands, and if this person got sick, like you just you just did it and you just kind of accepted that. And that's not bad, but I think it elucidates the actual relationship of how most people understand science, and that is by taking assumptions. Um, Now, again, if it turns out that you're right, again with the washing hand things, it's like, well,
You got lucky.
good. Yeah, yeah, that's good. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that.
Well, what I like about you bringing up the hand washing and the vaccination idea is it speaks to, so those are obviously positive and correct examples. Get vaccinated, wash your hands. But they speak to how um, real life and culture outside of an experimental and outside of a scientific methodological space is deterministic of the direction that science takes. So,
Could you
ancient
say that one more
peoples,
time?
so the examples of vaccinations and washing your hands and other things like that that you gave, um, they are examples of how culture and life and history and just sort of collective human knowledge outside of the scientific methodological space, outside of the experimental space that science occupies, all those things are determinative of science itself. And so let me describe it this way. Ancient peoples who had to do surgeries on each other eventually found out that infections go down whenever their hands have not just been in a pile of cow shit, right? Or when they've washed their hands somehow, or when they've cleaned the environment somehow,
Yeah,
as much as
sure.
they could with what they had.
Burn a
And
needle or whatever.
exactly. And so these
Hmm.
things are sort of determinative. These experiences that don't happen in an experimental space, from a scientific point of view. Now,
Hmm.
them finding this out, is that them doing science? No, it's them sort of stumbling upon reality in a way.
Yeah.
And so,
Or
just as it can lead to a positive outcome, it can also lead to something that's not quite correct or something that is challengeable, right? Something
mhm.
that is a little bit more dubious, especially when it regards stuff that is difficult to sense, difficult to understand from our scale, from our point of view. So you can make arguments about germs because we can see them with microscopes, right?
Hmm.
And we have the whole of human history to look back on for public health biology. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whenever you whenever you wash your hands and get vaccinated, fewer people get sick than if you don't. That's
Yeah.
that's not even really science at this stage. But
Right.
when it comes to the creation and the terminus of the universe, when it comes to the God particle, when it comes to, I guess, that which we don't know that we don't know, there's so much out there that, we make claims about, we make assumptions about, but we don't know how those assumptions even relate to reality because sometimes we don't even know those assumptions ourselves.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like we're endeavoring on, I guess what I'm saying is we're sort of shooting blindly with a lot of experimentation, dealing with stuff that we can't see or understand or really grasp in in an experimental sense, because
Hmm.
the nature of experimentation is isolating and is sort of grabbing something out of its context, because the
Hmm.
context is complicated and hard. It's
Yeah.
complicated and hard to talk about and to see as a whole system. But so I guess what I'm saying here is like, okay, understanding what happens when we blow two particles together at light speed. That's something fun and interesting and cool to do, with just one particle and one other particle in a big round circular tube full of electromagnets. That's like cool and informative, and it'll lead to something interesting, I'm sure. But
Hmm.
to think that that leads to anything other than more questions, to think that that leads to something true in the capital T sense about the world we live in, that's just a completely wrong idea, because these particles have been moved out of their context. They're not operating as they would in the real world. That's sort of the
Hmm.
shortcoming of experimentation, is that it pulls things out of context and isolates them. And by isolating them and observing them in that way, changes their outcome, changes their behavior.
Yeah.
And so the unforeseens, the things that we don't know that we don't know, those things are having a much stronger role in how the world actually works than we're giving credit to.
Yeah. I appreciate that view, and I would say that is nowhere more true than in psychological research.
Absolutely, yes.
That is the epitome of taking something out of its natural context. And um, I'm not saying that the experiments at the Hadron Space Collider or whatever, I'm not saying that they're not worth anything, but like I am saying that psychological research is worth very little because you are taking such a complex system, a single human person. A single human person is a incredibly complex system, and taking them out of an even more complex system and somehow trying to derive some distilled uh, ontological or epistemological truth of the mind from that. I would say it's not even really uh, I don't think that I think that we have to reconsider how we think about psychology. And I would say that there's even an argument that psychology is not a science
Mhm.
in the strict sense of the word science. That doesn't mean that it's useless. That just means that we have to focus our channel the best things about psychology, namely the fact that it is centered on human consciousness and on the mind and on feelings and on things that we cannot measure with scientific tools, but that are important nonetheless. So yeah, when you were saying that, it made me think this, and this is really cool because I think I put this in the essay, but it was kind of like this example of an Ashanti woman, which is it's like I think that's an indigenous clan in like Africa and Nigeria or something, and she Apaya gives this example of like um she gets sick because she doesn't boil the water. And then, there's this Western guy and he's like, hey, if you boil it, it'll kill all the germs and stuff like that. And she's like, no, the reason I got sick is because the spirits like haunted the water and then I drank it and then they invaded my body. And then when you boil the water and then people don't get sick, and then he shows her like, hey, see, like people aren't getting sick. Apaya says, well, from her perspective, the fire spirits like actually battled out the unclean drinking water spirits or whatever, and that's her model of reality. And it actually leads to the same conclusion. And so I want to ask you this, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. What do you think? We've talked a lot about challenging science, and I think we've kind of been doing that these last few minutes here of posing questions to science and posing, saying it's not just a monolith, it doesn't have all the answers, and also doing that with Buddhism. Um, but I actually am a bit more optimistic, I think, than Thompson is. Thompson says like there really can't be this relationship, and ultimately, I at least how I interpret it, he's saying if there is, it's kind of just a pious thing of like, well, they can coexist in the same place, but they can't actually merge. This is how I see it. As long as we're accountable, and that does take a lot of work. I'm not saying it's like easy necessarily to understand the philosophical underpinnings of science. I'm not saying that it's not, it doesn't take a lot of hard work to understand that, but I think that we can get to a point where we can question both, and I'm talking now more about consilience here, and use and we can use truths with a small t, personal experiences, to inform or at least to create questions that then science could somehow um, verify. So in other words, and maybe you'll disagree with me, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't say, you know, let's create this experiment in physics, where we try to see how particles are connected or something like this, because this scientist had this mushroom experience where he saw, very vividly the interconnectedness of all the molecules in the universe or some shit. Well, I think that you can actually create, somehow falsifiable experiments based on that. I'm not saying that you can necessarily falsify, whatever spiritual truth he landed on or thought he landed on. Um, but I'll give this example really quickly. So, Francis Crick, who is, I believe, the co-discoverer of the double helix model of DNA, he actually attributes his discovery of that shape of DNA to an LSD trip that he had back in the 60s. Crick is a really hardcore science guy. He died a very outspoken militant atheist. And yet from his mystical experience, we now have, thanks to him and Watson, uh the the double helix, we know what DNA looks like now. And we know how it works, we know how transcription works, we know how RNA and DNA do their thing. I don't really know that much about it actually, but you kind of get my point,
Mhm.
about how we can derive truths from religious, mystical, like insights from religion or from experience, and then actually do some sort of scientific experiments with that. I think that it's possible.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned that. Um, I'm not saying that you're wrong about Francis Crick and Watson, but I do want to say that um, he should also have given some credit to Rosalind Franklin.
Uh, yeah, yeah, of course.
Um,
She's could you say who she is?
yeah, so yeah, we're talking about the story of discovery of the molecular structure of DNA, and Watson and Crick were banging their heads against the walls and couldn't figure it out. They couldn't come up with a real, actual, applicable, practical model. And Rosalind Franklin, instead of sort of banging her head against the wall, she was sort of busy the whole time looking by means of X-ray crystallography. I don't need
Mhm.
to tell you what that actually is in
Yeah.
practice, but she sort of eventually she came up through this method with an image of the molecule, um, we see, the two sort of coils coiled around each other. Imagine if you took like a planar image perpendicular to that, what it would look like, right? So it would have like, um, it would have a line, and then you would see sort of blurry twists around it. You can look up
Mhm.
the image that she came up with. What I'm saying is, Watson and Crick sort of stole the show from a woman who did an enormous amount of work and ended up dying of cancer caused by radiation exposure from doing X-ray crystallography with no protective equipment for her whole life. Um,
Yeah. No, thank you for bringing that up. That's the historical facts. That's
but what you're
and that's
saying about
important.
this idea of
Mhm.
like they had an acid trip and then that helped, right? I think that you're speaking to something important about identifying two different ways of thinking and approaching knowledge production based on common assumptions.
Mhm.
So we've just sat here and we've said even science is based on assumptions, and assumptions can be challenged, right? We've been sitting here and saying not only is that true of science, that's true of any field of endeavor, any field of academia that we come up with. Assumptions can and often should and are challenged. Um, you said if we sit here with psychology and psychiatry for a long enough time, we would stop thinking about it as science in the way that we understand the word. And I think that that would be true of any science that we
Mhm.
sit with for long enough, biology, chemistry, physics, etc. We would stop thinking about it as science
Okay.
in a lot of ways
Yeah.
because they also, I mean, you're right that the human mind and human existence is the most complicated thing, and trying to isolate it for experimental purposes is ridiculous. But in the exact same way, isolating anything in biology, chemistry, physics, what have you, for experimental purposes makes the exact same mistake and causes the exact same problems. You just
Mm.
simply, after a certain point, you simply start to lose credibility with regards to your claims, right?
Yeah, I could see that in biology. Like, if you're gonna culture something, it's like, well, that stomach bacteria doesn't exist in a plastic disc with like
Mm-hmm.
agar at the bottom of it. It exists inside your stomach, and it's hard to do experiments on bacteria that's like actually in your stomach right now. I'm not
Right.
saying there's not ways of doing it, but um, I think I kind of get what you mean.
Yeah, no, I mean, like something that has only recently become a thing in biology, for example, and I only know this because I studied it in the distant past, many, many, many rebirths ago. Um, I, I I think that it's only recently becoming a thing where microbiologists or biochemists are starting to accept that they have to also do ecology at the same time as they do microbiology and biochemistry. What I mean
Mm,
by that is ecology obviously studies how a bunch of different living things coexist together next to each other in the same
mhm,
place at the same time. What they do, how does that work? How does that change them over time, et cetera?
mhm,
It used to be this idea that biochemistry was the mechanism that determined ecology. So the smallest scale was where the big movements were going on that affected the largest scale.
mhm.
So the
Kind of
reason,
extrapolates outward or
yeah.
upward.
And so that's why people who did biochemistry or biophysics or all these small, small scale things, what I mean by small scale is dealing with stuff that is physically very small.
Mhm,
Um, they thought that they were like at the root of all of it, at the root of the world when they were doing
mhm,
this, and that ecologists were just sort of describing the downstream effects of what they were doing. But now they're realizing that it's not linear, it's not a stream in that sense, it's circular. At the same time as what happens on the biochemical level affects the ecosystem level, so too does the ecosystem level affect the biochemical level
mhm,
in a circle.
mhm,
We used to teach biology in this way, in the way of there's the level of subatomic particles, and it goes from that scale all the way up to the entire biosphere, the entire Earth, where there's tons of different animals, tons of different creatures, tons of different living things of varying types that all exist in the same place. And if you pick one of these levels to study at, that's the level you're at. and that's what
Hmm.
you spend your life doing. You can spend your whole life doing proteins, or you can spend your whole life observing how human habitation and elephant habitations are affecting each other, right?
Hmm.
Um, it's not like that at all anymore. And we are figuring that out. It's a good thing.
Yeah. What's
So
it changing to?
it's changing to this circular model that I was talking about, where,
Oh, okay.
if you're going to study the ecology of elephants, you also have to have an understanding of the microbiology of their habitats. And if you're
Hmm.
going to study, the microbiology of, um, you know, the human stomach, you have to also understand the ecology of food or the ecology of humans. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah.
You can't stick at one scale and expect to get anywhere. And when you start to think of it like that, now you're looking at systems, and now you're starting to sort of push up against the boundaries of what's possible with experimentation as the primary method for knowledge production. And
Mm.
you're stopping yourself from sounding like science anymore.
Yeah. Kind of
um,
like I'm thinking of the fact that we now know that gut bacteria actually plays a huge role in like mental well-being.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's like an ecological thing that's also microbiological and is also, it's at the scale all the way from an individual bacteria all the way up to like human ecology,
Hmm.
how all of us
Mm.
have food available to us and what that food does to us, right?
Hmm.
What kind of food it is and what it does to us. So I want to come back to the thing that you actually asked me. um,
Yeah, that was a good building the foundation,
it
I
was
think.
productive, yeah. So the thing you
Hmm.
actually asked me was about sort of consilience, finding common ground between two different ways of approaching knowledge production. Um, and I spoke to this idea of common assumptions, right?
Hmm.
So I think that identifying common assumptions is a great way to start, right? So when I started speaking about this change in assumption from a linear scale understanding of biology to a circular scale understanding of biology, in that moment, I sort of identified a common assumption between, um, you could say maybe between biology and something else. I don't know what, but you know what I'm saying? You've identified an assumption and you are opening yourself up to identifying another common assumption. And so when it comes to science
Like
and
from
religion,
within each of the disparate fields, like your
yes.
assumptions from, let's just say, like you're taking an insight from a meditation and you want to do a physics experiment on that. Like, can we use that as an example?
Yeah, you have found an assumption and you want to find a common one somewhere else. That's one way to do it. Another
Hmm.
way to sort of to do it is to just um, understand the desire that underlies both um, both disparate fields. So,
Hmm.
what is science trying to do, and what is religion trying to do, and how are they doing it? Why are they doing it differently?
Mm.
Science is trying to produce as much knowledge as possible about the nature of ourselves, about the nature of reality, about the nature of, our lives and what happens to us before, during, and after we are alive. And I presented it in that specific fashion because I wanted to drive home that it sounds a lot like what religion is trying to do, you know,
Mm.
what religious people who write religious texts and who practice religion are trying to do. And there's differences in there, of course, but and there's especially differences with regards to how they do the thing they say they're doing. But
Yeah.
that's a common assumption, right? The assumption is that there's a beginning, middle, and end. The assumption is that that beginning, middle, and end is identifiable and is sort of presentable and is cognizable to the human experience. And we can base our human behavior in this life on what we have sort of decided one way or the other about that beginning, middle, and end. You know,
So, with respect to consciousness, would you, because I put establishing common assumptions, would you say then specifically about the mind, if we're talking about consilience for uh figuring out like what the mind is, like
yes.
figuring it? Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And so you have to sort of pick up the right tool at the right time. So if you ask a question that cannot be answered through experimentation, then you simply leave experimentation behind. If you pick up a question that can only be determined by experimentation, then you have to use experimentation as your tool. So what I'm talking about here is like experimentation is useful in a lot of cases for the sciences. We've spent this whole time challenging it and, kind of pulling and tugging at it, but it is useful for, you know, if my question is what happens to stuff in my hand whenever I let go of it,
Hmm.
the best way to find out is to pick something up and then drop it, right? And I'll find out gravity exists, right? It falls. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a point where experimentation is useful. A point where experimentation is not useful. Why does it fall down? Does that make sense? And so when it comes
Yeah.
to I mean, yes, why does it fall down? The answer is gravity. But I just
Why
demonstrate
does gravity exist?
exactly. Is
Yeah.
experimentation useful for that? I think that's
Yeah.
debatable, you know?
Or is it even like, could you even come to an answer about that question through our whatever the scientific method is? Um, Kind of like you were saying with the hand washing thing thousands of years ago. I think that there is like, I would say that that's scientific, although it doesn't take the scientific model that we know today, but that's
Exactly.
fine because they still arrived at the answer of, yeah, let's not, cover our hands in pig's blood and then do a surgery on someone because people will get sick. The outcome is the same. You clean and you wash your hands. You just didn't arrive at it through the scientific method that we learned in school.
Exactly.
Hmm.
The kami tradition in Japan, which we have now sort of come to call Shinto, they have this idea that death is a morally polluting thing. Death makes you dirty. It
Hmm.
attracts its own. It attracts itself. So if you are around a lot of death, then death will come to you or those you love in some way. And everything on top of that, all the moral aspect of that is maybe I'll just call it sauce for now. But the
Okay.
chicken beneath it, I think, in a lot of ways, is a public health situation. Why do they think
Hmm.
that death is polluting? Because when a body dies, the putrefaction process makes you sick. It's like a very, very, very dangerous epidemiological thing if there's
Hmm.
dead stuff around you. Putrefaction is like a public health concern, a caution, that you should be cautionary of. And so, yeah, you can put a bunch of sauce and say, it's because death is like a moral thing and it attracts death and it makes you polluted in some way. But really, what we're talking about here is like, if you're around a dead body for too long, you will get sick. And if you get sick, you or others around you might also get sick and die. You know,
Hmm.
does that make
Yeah.
sense? And so I'm not saying Kami tradition worshippers and Shinto people, I'm not saying they're the original Japanese public health biologists. I'm saying that the same result is that like we stay away from dead stuff because it's a hazard to our health. Um,
Yeah.
and so these are places where there's common assumptions at work and where we can start to pursue similar questions, making use of the best tools for answering those questions. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where experimental ways of producing knowledge and non-experimental ways of producing knowledge as different tools become relevant. Can you do an
Hmm.
experiment to find out that corpses are a public health hazard? Yes, you can. Can you do an experiment to figure out why they are a hazard? No, you cannot. Right.
Hmm. Oh, because like you need a theory to make sense of the data. Like you
Sort of. I mean, you can
the
figure out why in the sense you can identify germs, but
hmm.
like, I guess the question of like, in a metaphysical sense, why? You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
Like,
Oh, yeah. Like why does this all exist type of why.
yeah, like why does death produce germs in this way and not life or something? It's a bad example, but my point is like there are questions for which experimentation works and questions for which it doesn't. And
Yeah.
knowing which tool to pull out of the toolbox at the right moment is very, very important. You can't
Yeah.
do, and that's what Evan Thompson speaks to here. You can't do an experiment to demonstrate that selfhood exists in the brain. You simply can't do that. And to try to do that and then to pull out any evidence you get from that and say that it verifies that claim is completely misguided, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not an experimentable claim.
hmm It's not even, yeah, it's not even within the domain of science to begin with.
Right.
Um, yeah, that's really cool. As you were saying that, and this is kind of the takeaway for me, I think, with respect to consilience is, you're saying like, take out the right tool for the right job. I was literally thinking of like, let's say you're digging a mine shaft and you have a shovel and it's dirt, 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 and then you get to a big fucking rock. Well, you're not going to use your shovel on the rock because you're going to break the shovel. You'd break out a pickaxe and then you'd break the rock. And then once there's no more rock, you're not going to dig out the dirt with a pickaxe. So you'd go back to the shovel. Um, and I guess that's kind of how I thought that maybe we can go about using mystical experiences or any kind of experiences, but I think mystical experiences are, to me, elucidate, you know, the most profound ontological truths, even if maybe they turn out not to be true. At least it's something interesting to start with.
And
And
it
that,
speaks to what the brain is up to, you know.
yeah, yeah, I think so too. Even though, you know, you don't have to take a neurocentric view of the mind to say like, you know, there's something going on here.
Mhm.
And we can derive some sort of story and see it and see if it's true. And if it's not, then fuck it. Like, you know, at least we found out, and then we're one step closer to the truth. So yeah, that's kind of what I thought of. And I'm glad that you brought up the tool analogy because I was actually going to take that section out of like the mission statement blurb for my website, but now I'm going to keep it there because I think it's actually very fitting now that I think about it in that way of like, well, we've reached this point where conducting an experiment literally can't even happen because we can't do an experiment on that. Um, let's see if we can get a lot of philosophers together and intuit something based on, you know, what we have at this uh block, you know, roadblock that we're stopped at, and then say, oh, huh, well, maybe with, you know, this idea that we just intuited from thinking without experiments, then maybe we can actually come up with something that is falsifiable and that we could actually run some sort of experiments on. Um, that's what I think.
You're never going to believe it. I'm going to do it twice. There's a Buddhist story about this.
Okay, let's hear it.
Again, the upshot of the story is a little bit different, but
Mhm.
it's
Sure.
possible to apply it here.
hmm
The Buddha had to preach to an audience, as he often did, but
hmm
then the task came upon him to preach to a man who was hungry. And the man sitting there hungry, do you think that he sat there and gave him the Lotus Sutra? No, he didn't. He didn't sit there and preach to him for, in translation on a typed page would end up being 300 pages worth of sermon. He didn't do that. He fed him. He fed him because the man didn't need the Dharma right then. And the Buddha knew this. The man didn't need the Dharma. He needed to be fed.
Okay.
And it was only after he was fed that he would realize that, he was open to the Dharma, that he could receive the Dharma in any way. If you're hungry and the Buddha says life is suffering, you're only thinking about hunger. If you're hungry and the Buddha says, the cause of suffering is desire, you're only thinking about hunger. If he says that there is an end to suffering and it's the eightfold path, you are only thinking about hunger.
Yeah.
I mean, I could
Or
go on.
KFC.
Yeah, exactly. You are hungry. You need to eat.
hmm
And then after, and this is speaking to how your approach, and I don't mean you specifically, I mean you, everybody, your approach has to
hmm
be sort of catered as an academic, I should say, academics out there who are listening, your approach has to be catered to the problem at hand. You know, if you encounter the rock, like you say, switch to the pickaxe because the shovel will not do anything. You know, in fact, I bet the man would have just gotten hungrier and the situation would have just gotten worse if the Buddha preached, the Lotus Sutra or God forbid the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is 1100 pages typed out in English.
You're like,
Um,
fuck this guy. I'm gonna be coming in Shantika and see who else will feed
at
me.
least they have food, you know.
Yeah.
And so he knew the moment, like what's needed here, not this. And so that's what I think is sort of relevant to what you're saying here. That's what I thought of when you were talking about picking up the right tool for the right moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good example. And it also points back towards the ethical dimension of cosmopolitanism quite nicely, I would say, of like, you know what, just feed them. That's simple. Just do the right thing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we're kind of at towards the end of our discussion of cosmopolitanism. I had one more idea, and then we can kind of wrap up with closing thoughts. So throughout this chapter and throughout the book, where I'm not white, but I'm passably white. My Spanish kind of sucks, even though I'm Mexican. You're a white guy. We're both American. English is both of our first native languages. Um, and yet we're looking at all these different traditions and religions that are not our native ones, and we're passing some form of judgment on them. Not judgment in the sense of saying it's bad, but judgment in the sense of making an assessment and talking about it. Um, so, and I wrote about this a little bit in my essay. How do you balance that with not being racist, not being colonialist, not being imperialist, but also be able to say this is bad and to call it out? And I'll use Buddhism as an example here. Early Buddhism is extremely misogynistic. I
Mhm.
don't even want to say some of the things that the Buddha is purported to have said about women out loud because they're that bad.
They're real
Um,
bad.
they're really bad. They're really bad. And that's a problem. Um, but what if I'm not saying it like I'm actually like afraid of this happening, but it's like, what's to prevent someone from telling me, hey, actually you're having white settler colonialist mentality about this. This is the historical tradition, when actually, like, from my perspective, no, it's just bad to talk about women that way and to treat women that way. Um, could I could I get your way in here?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, while you were describing that, I was thinking about what you said earlier about accountability. It's not racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, colonialist, imperialist, ethnocentric, Eurocentric, any of that stuff to press accountability, to demand accountability for stuff. And, you know, I think that if you ask me this question and you ask a Buddhist monk this question, you'll get two different answers that both say the same thing. So the reason why I say that is because, like, we've talked about this before. Even though I go to a Buddhist temple every week, and even though like I have a bunch of Buddhist stuff, like on my microphone right now are two omamori. This one is Samantabhadra, right? And this is from a Shinto shrine, but this is
Oh,
Samantabhadra.
cool.
So like even
Oh,
take that
cool.
claim that I'm not a Buddhist as you will. um, but anyways, I'm an outsider. I look at stuff from the outside. I'm a scholar. I observe and I do, like you say, I pass judgments about Buddhism as an outsider. But what's important is that I'm doing it with evidence. So when I say early Buddhism is misogynistic, I have what the Buddha said available to me for that claim. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
can pull out quotes. We don't
Yeah.
want to, but we can. And
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so it's important, one, to demand accountability, rely on evidence specifically as an outsider to be able to say this stuff because you don't want to like because racism, sexism, ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, colonialism, imperialism, these things don't demand evidence. They don't demand a burden of proof.
Mm,
You don't have to whenever I am a racist and I say, you know, this race is inferior to mine, I don't have to give a reason for it to be racist. Does that make sense?
yeah. But
In
what
fact,
about people who like Ben Shapiro for evidence, or for instance, he does use evidence. He just uses evidence to say like, oh, look, the census data, blah blah blah, says that homosexual relationships don't last as long, and therefore it's because being gay is bad, obviously. I mean, he's using evidence, but he's giving like a shitty analysis of it.
well, that's the other, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the answer right there is the shitty analysis. So like,
Mm,
um, you have to also be open to other factors, right? So the reason why I said about a Buddhist monk, I gave the answer, early Buddhism is misogynist. There's evidence for it. Look at these quotes. A Buddhist monk might be more apologistic and say early Buddhism is indeed misogynistic. But the reason why is because the Buddha's audience came up in a misogynistic sort of world. Samsara is misogynistic. And because of that, the Buddha had to teach in terms that they understood. And he said that stuff to them to sort of speak to their sensibilities. Even though he is an enlightened person who obviously has no thoughts or concerns about gender or sex in any way, he had to employ those sort of discourses in his teaching, you know, to to sort of be there with his audience. So a Buddhist monk gives that answer, and that last step, it's an answer that is out there that people say about this. That last step to me is shitty analysis because there's no value added to the Dharma by it being misogynist. There's
and
no
there and there's no proof that there would be value to
right.
it.
You can't prove that there could be value. Yeah. And
Hmm.
so additionally, so that's the next step that they took. The next step that outsiders take is that the Buddha was a historical man. He was born and raised in a historical situation which was misogynistic, and it just came into his teaching, and he couldn't get it out because he was a person. We can't get rid of our biases in every case. He was just a person, and that happened. Or alternatively, the other option is the people who wrote the sutras down were misogynistic, and they put their misogyny into the Buddha's mouth in order to elevate it to the level of, the divine and make it authoritative because the Buddha said it.
Hmm.
Either case is much better analysis because it's predicated on evidence. And we can prove that, actually, yes, the people who wrote the sutras down, not the Buddha who gave it, we can't verify him for anything. But the people who wrote the sutras down on paper, the versions we have now, they were misogynistic people. And so that's way easier to claim. So you have to have good evidence and you have to make, good analysis of that evidence. And if you do that, then there's no danger, so to speak.
Mm.
Especially, I mean, I study dead people and dead Buddhism and dead Buddhists. And so that takes away a lot of the danger from me myself because I can talk about dead people all I want and what are they going to say? you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
or alternatively, if I'm not talking about dead people, I'm talking about buildings and statues. And again, what are they going to do about it? um,
Yeah.
but uh, for people who study actual living individuals, um, then you have to be extra, extra, extra careful with the analysis you bring to the real lived evidence that's in front of you. So, for example, one of our mutual friends is a digital ethnographer. She studies the practice of religion as it sort of is embodied and is taking place on TikTok. And um, because her subject of study is actual real living people, she has to be careful how she approaches them, how she uses information that she gains from them, either in interviews or through observation of their TikToks. And she has to be careful about how she presents that information in a scholarly fashion. She can't name names, obviously. She
Hmm.
can't even really deeply describe the content of the videos because then that's identifiable. And you
Hmm.
would think to yourself, oh, that's ridiculous. They're posting this on TikTok for the whole world to see. You know, they've sort of, by posting it, they have consented to its use in public. But academia is, it requires you to be the bigger person and recognize, no, that's not actually true.
Hmm.
Just because it's posted online doesn't mean that they've consented to you taking it and saying stuff about them. You know,
Yeah.
academia is like, no, that's actually as immoral as, taking it. That's like basically, that's almost in some sense a different version of cyberbullying, right?
Hmm.
If you're
Mm.
not saying bad stuff, that's fine, right? That's good. But cyberbullies take stuff you posted online and they say bad stuff about you because of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so it calls on academics to be sort of even more careful than that. So when you're dealing with living subjects, you have to be just the most accountable and ethical person that you can be ever. And you have to be the most careful about harm and abuse ever, you know,
Yeah.
in this sort of relationship you have with your living subjects. My career might be threatened if I say crazy shit about dead people, that's not really based on evidence, but I'm not harming those dead people by saying that, in my opinion. I'm not,
Yeah.
if I take stuff from somebody who's long gone, they don't own it anymore. They're not here. They are not compromised by what I say and what I do. So the doors open up for me a bit more than if someone's alive.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I took from that is you said like be the bigger person. And kind of what I took from that is calling out the action or the behavior or the idea, not the person. And that is the simplest, most fucking hard thing to do, but it is so necessary.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I have trouble with that. It's hard. Like if you see someone, uh, I don't know, just beat the shit out of an old lady at the bus stop for no reason, then of course you think that's a terrible human being. But, you know, you have to kind of zoom out and say like, well, if this person was not doing that behavior and instead helped that old lady onto the bus, then that would be a good person. And so I can't say that that person's like a fallen human being because it's the action that was bad. Although, yes, they're obviously responsible for it. I'm not
Of
saying that
course.
they're
Yeah.
not, but um, what was I gonna say? Yeah, and like again, I'll bring the discussion back to the ongoing genocide in Gaza. It's like we have this the mainstream consensus is that you cannot criticize Zionism because if you do, then you're anti-Semitic. Well, first of all, that's not even true because Zionism is one strain of Judaism. It doesn't speak for all of it. There are many outspoken Jews who are not Zionists and who speak out against that perspective. But um, and it's at the point now where the reality, the statistical reality, is that most Israeli Jews are Zionists, and Zionism is an inherently colonial, expansionist, religious ideology. That's that's just an objective fact. Um, but that doesn't mean that they themselves are bad, and we know this. Like we can call out Zionism without saying that human beings are corrupted, and because then that's actually anti-Semitic. Then that's actually hating Jewish people and being racist. Um, and I know that's you know, a dark example, but it's a real one, and it's one that's having an impact on our world in real time. So, um, yeah, but it's like stick to that, call out the behavior, call out the action, absolutely, call out the idea, but you know, then that ethical, I would say, very aligned with Buddhist perspective of also do it with a spirit of compassion. Um, yes, accountability more now than ever, but in service of we need this so that everyone can heal. You know, Israel and Gaza and Israel can heal. Um, so ended on, you know, kind of a heavy note, but it's happening right now. So I think we need to talk about it. Um, thank you for your perspective on all of that, Nick. I think this was a really, I know I say that every time, but I think this was my favorite chapter, and I really love this episode. So we have reached the end of Why I Am Not a Buddhist by Evan Thompson. Um, so I want to get two rates from you. What would be your rate in terms of his main goal of trying to speak against Buddhist modernism and dismantle that and say why it doesn't work? And then just in general, what rating would you give it?
Yeah, in terms of whether his goal is achieved by what he's written, um, I would say probably 4.6 or like 4.8 out of 5.
Oh,
And
okay.
and
That's pretty good.
it's pretty good, yeah. And
Yeah.
where he has lost are on places that I've talked about
Okay,
on
how about
previous
out of 10
episodes.
then?
Out of 10, I would just say pretty much an even 9 out of
Okay.
10. And he's lost points on stuff I've talked about previously.
Hmm.
I had a lot of issues with his non-self, not so fast chapter, if you remember.
Yeah.
And that's really huge in my rating now. Is like you were doing so well and you did so well in so many ways. And that chapter was just the weakest for me of the whole thing. Um,
Hmm.
not because of not because of the argumentative aspect of it or because of like how it fits into taking down Buddhist modernism, but if you remember, it just, in my view, he was replacing one misguided view with another when it came to this issue of non-self, and it didn't land with me. So it was 9 out of 10 because of that. And just in general, in terms of like enjoying reading it, um, I'm this might be a little controversial, but it's actually going to be a lower rating. It's going to be 8 out of 10 for me for just enjoyment of reading it. 10 out
Okay.
of 10 enjoying talking about it and having a show about it with you, but 8 out of 10 just for my joy reading it because um, it's not meant to be a scholarly monograph in a traditional academic sense where he
Yeah.
starts out with, you know, a claim that he's going to provide a bunch of evidence for, and then he does. It bends back and forth between being like a personal testimonial and manifesto and also being an academic project. And that back and forth just got me sometimes.
Yeah.
One paragraph we're talking about Upaka, one paragraph we're talking about, the Buddha, and the next paragraph we're talking about 1970s neuroscientists. And and we're talking about like, and then he's telling us, I used to think this way and I used to do all this stuff. Here's why it's all wrong. Also, this story of, you know, Yanni Ponica or something like, and it's just the jumping around, just structurally speaking, as a work of literature, it's hard to sort of follow with, especially when you don't know how to categorize what you're reading. Is it a monograph? Is it a testimonial? Is it a manifesto? Is it all of those? And so I don't think that he was trying to make the biggest academic impact and win the most readers with this book. And so he's not worried. He's not sitting here like worried, oh no, did I put out a testimonial? Did I put out a manifesto? Did I put out an academic
Make a
monograph.
significant contribution to academia or
Yeah, he's
something.
not worried about that. And so I'm
Hmm.
not going to labor over too much of it either. I just will say that it made it harder to read.
Yeah, I get that. I can almost see it kind of like in and out of like your world of professional academia, like very much so, like you're saying, it's like get he gets into this like very deep historical analysis, and then, and I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying like for like specifically your readability, it's like the next thing we're talking about like mindfulness studios in New York or whatever.
Mm,
And again, I didn't think it was bad, but I can totally get that from your perspective. I've thought a few times about like what if Alexander Mayer or our, Professor Callahan, were to read this. And I feel like honestly they probably just, if you explain the thesis of it to them, they'll probably be like, oh yeah, oh okay, cool. Like I
yeah.
agree with that. Like and what? Like they just it's not even on their radar because that's not their main interest. Their main interest is deep dives into the historical um text and yeah. Uh that's just one way of that I've thought about it myself. Um cool. Yeah, I think I'd give the same first rating, 9 out of 10 for his argumentation. Um I mean, he does a really good job. I think I
I
want to
agree.
give. Yeah, yeah, he does a very good argument, a very good takedown of Buddhist modernism. And for me personally, I think I might give it a 10 out of 10. It's not a perfect book. There's, a lot of flaws with it, but that's explicitly just because of the trajectory of my own interests. I mean, there's so much crossover between this and between psychotherapy. And a lot of what he is saying about Buddhist modernism applies very well to psychology and psychotherapy and the endeavors of mental health. Um, and it's it was very frustrating for me to contend with the first time that I read it. I mean,
Because you wanted to be a Buddhist and he said why I'm not a Buddhist, right? Like you were
I
like
had just taken my precepts
antithetical.
5 months ago.
Yeah.
I'm like, damn it, dude, what the fuck did I do that retreat for? Um,
And it's like
but
it makes you mad because it's convincing you, right? It's like
yeah,
I'm not mad because he's like being mean to Buddhism or being mean to me. I'm mad because like I'm seeing that oh no.
yeah, yeah. Oh, it was so frustrating. And and it's funny, and this would actually be a cool episode in the future, but my senior capstone project, like the undergrad thesis or whatever, I had written a paper that wasn't explicitly Buddhist modernist, and I actually think I did a fairly good job of avoiding that because Mayer was very diligent about like, hey, don't just stick with what you know. Um, but I absolutely wanted to take that and go all in on the Buddhist modernist, like Buddhist psychology and like Buddhist psychotherapy, and that's kind of where I was going to go with that. And then I read his book and I'm like, fuck, dude, I can't do that anymore. What the hell, Thompson? And yeah, so but I also loved it for that reason, and that I could look at myself very clearly and say like, oh, okay, that actually isn't tenable. That actually doesn't work. Um, so yeah, I think, 10 out of 10 or somewhere very close behind, like 9.5 or something. Just personally, just because I really love this book. Um, so yeah, any final words?
No, just thank you to Evan Thompson for writing this. If you've by some crazy chance listened to any of this, you know, we're sorry. You've been a very good sport. Um, talk about the book and not the
I feel
person.
I feel like he's open-minded.
Yeah, yeah. And I also want to say thank you to you for having me on. And I will leave you with I'll leave you with a final question instead. What do you want to read next?
Uh I would actually like to go over that paper that I mentioned. It's a survey analysis of Yogacara Buddhism and cognitive behavioral therapy, and just looking at some like overlapping crossovers between that, and then see kind of in light of Thompson, like how'd I do? Did I do Buddhist modernisty stuff, and or did I do something interesting? Yeah, and I don't know. Well,
Perfect.
how
I
does that
can't
sound
wait.
to you?
Yeah, that
Cool,
sounds great.
cool. Awesome. All right. Well, it only took 1 year, but we've finally finished the book. Nick, thanks so much. Check out Nick's podcast, Bright on Buddhism. It's available on all platforms. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again in the future.
Awesome. Can't wait to see you next time.
Yeah. All right. Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.